So let's talk about meno. And what I want to do is just give a really sort of a broad picture of what's happening in this dialogue, and then maybe come to a few conclusions and maybe ask some questions. So Meno is a dialogue between Socrates and somebody who he knows, and the bottom line in this dialogue is the question: is virtue teachable? Now, Meno is a really old dialogue from a long, long time ago. But there is a very important question here, because any parent who wants his or her his child to be virtuous must kind of deal with this question of, is virtue teachable? Because if it is, then I'm going to teach them to be virtuous. You know, there's a lot of things we want kids to be, but we want them to grow up to be good people. And so this question isn't just academic. It's really sort of, if you're a parent or if you are a teacher and you have people under you, you want them to be virtuous, and then you have to wonder, well, how do we get them virtuous? You know, is it something we can teach? Is it a lesson? Is it certain things they have to memorize? Do we send them to a good school? Do we send them to church? Do we send them to Boy Scouts? What do we do to make somebody virtuous? So this is a question that is really important for everybody's life. And so this dialogue, it's a fairly easy concept to sort of walk through, but it goes on a bunch of different tangents, and it's easy to get lost in this dialogue. But if we think about it, there are a couple different things happening, and really I would say maybe three major things happening. First of all, is this question, is virtue teachable? And Socrates is going to go through typical Socrates stuff where it's like, well, I don't know if it's teachable. You need to define what we mean by virtue. And a lot of people get really frustrated with Socrates. In fact, this is one of the reasons he ends up beginning on trial and getting killed, is because he keeps bugging people with these sorts of questions. So this is the Socratic method, also called the elenchus, which is a teaching method of examining somebody. And so when they're trying to find something out, you need to ask them, what do you mean by that? And so you're defining and kind of narrowing in on what this is. Because if virtue is teachable, or is it, this question, is it teachable? Well, I don't know. What do we mean by virtue? And what you find out is a lot of people have a feeling that they know what virtue is, but you really don't know how to define it. And so really this first section is this question of, well, what is virtue? How are we defining virtue? What do you mean by that? And then there's a section where it seems to go off on this other tangent, which is, how do we know anything? And then Socrates is going to basically give his idea of recollection. And that is that you don't really learn anything, but you end up, since our souls are eternal and they've been here before, we recollect stuff. And so it's not a matter of learning new things. It is a issue of remembering things. And this happens all the time, right? Like, who won the Academy Award 3 years ago for whatever. It's like, oh, I know this. Like I watched it and I think I know what it is. And then it's not a matter of going out and finding it, but it's, oh, who was it? And you try to remember it. And so Socrates says basically all knowledge is this recollection. And then we have him sort of move to another part of this dialogue, which is he's going to say, okay, the elenchus isn't working. Like, we're not able to get to this definition. So I'm going to kind of go with a different strategy, and that is I'm going to present a hypothesis, and I'm going to, kind of state something about knowledge and teachability and that sort of thing. And then that's sort of where it goes. So if you think about it in those three basic movements of what is virtue, and then this section on recollection, and then it's sort of ending with this section about knowledge and the difference between knowledge and true belief. And what is this? Okay, so the first major section, when we think about Socrates and Meno talking, and Meno comes to him and says, is virtue teachable? And then, of course, Socrates is going to do his typical Socrates stuff and says, I don't know if it's teachable or not. I don't even know what virtue is. Will you define it for me? And, it's kind of the same thing if you go up to somebody and say, can you teach someone how to do a jump shot? And if you don't know what basketball is, like, well, I don't know if you could teach them or not. What are you talking about? Like, oh, you go up to the basket and you throw the ball in. It's like, okay, so we need a definition first. And we see what happens like in Euthyphro is there's going to be this long sort of back and forth between what is virtue. And so, Meno starts with saying, well, what is virtue? Well, there are a lot of different virtues, different virtues. Like, one for men, they need to know how to run business. And then women have a virtue where they need to learn how to, cook and clean. Of course, it's very sexist, long time ago. And, so there's a lot of different virtues depending on, who you are. Socrates is like, wow, this is awesome. You've given me a whole swarm of examples. I just wanted a definition and you gave me like 50 definitions, right? And so I really need to know what it is, but you've just given me different examples. And this is very similar to Euthyphro. And then, another, Meno tries this. Is like, well, virtue is ruling over others. And then he says, well, okay, but you just said like children and slave have certain kind of virtue. Do they rule over others? Well, no, not really. What I mean is it's ruling over others justly. Okay. And so then one of the major things that happens here is like, okay, so if virtue is ruling over somebody justly or doing anything justly, well, it seems like justice is a virtue. So you are essentially defining virtue by saying, here's a virtue. And that is, what we would call a tautology, which is, what is a circle? Well, a circle is a circle. That doesn't really help me. Okay. So again, what he's trying to do is figure out, okay, so what is so what do we mean by virtue? And, what ends up happening is you realize that it's really hard to give a definition of virtue, but we can think of different virtues, courage, honesty, all those kind of things, right? So we could start listing virtues without ever really defining what they are. And then there's a section, again, where it's sort of easy to get lost in this, but you can sort of go through this section without missing a whole lot, where Socrates is then going to say, well, okay, let me define not a shape, because you could say like a square is a shape or a circle is a shape. She's like, I'll go ahead and define just shape. All right. Like, what is shape? Well, it's where color starts and stops or something. And so what he's doing with shape and color is he's trying to give an example of what a definition of a very large category of things looks like. Meno's like, well, okay, I'm not really sure if I'm buying this or not. So then Meno's going to go for another definition. So he says, okay, let's try this definition. Virtue is knowing the beneficial thing and having power to acquire it. All right. So okay, and then this is one of the really super interesting questions in Meno. It's like, okay, so virtue is knowing the good thing and acquiring it. All right. So in other words, it's sort of desiring the right thing. It's desiring good things. And then Socrates asks this question that a lot of people, we could just have a discussion about this forever, where he says, well, everyone desires beneficial things. And this is where a lot of times people stop and say, well, no, that's not true. Because there's sometimes people desire bad things. Somebody who smokes and you desire to go have a cigarette. Well, that's a bad thing, right? So Socrates isn't right. But what Socrates is going to say is, well, yes, I mean, from an objective point of view, that is bad, but the person doesn't want this to smoke the cigarette because he wants lung cancer. He basically is smoking the cigarette because it gives him a good feeling. And he might know that, like, I really shouldn't smoke. Like one cigarette doesn't give you lung cancer. You have to have a bunch of cigarettes to do that, right? So I'm just having one. But what he is desiring is not something bad. He's desiring a good feeling, that nicotine feeling, right? And so that is, he wants to feel good, and so he does it. Even, you think about drug addicts, those sorts of things, that, yes, that's a bad thing, but they are desiring it because they want to feel good. Even something as bad as suicide, right? Which you look as the ultimate horror that could happen to somebody. But the reason these people are doing it isn't a bad, I mean, it is bad that they have to do this, but they are looking for maybe relief from pain, those sorts of things. And so if you look at it, they are actually desiring what they see as good. And so what Socrates is saying with this is that, well, if somebody is desiring good, everybody desires good things. In other words, they desire to feel good, to do something that makes them, in some sort of better condition. And so, but it's not true that everyone is virtuous. So it can't just be the desire for something good. And so this is when Socrates says, all right, so Meno, let's go look for this knowledge together. Let's go look for this definition together. And then this is the super famous Meno's riddle that is one of the most famous questions in philosophy, where Meno says, well, how can we learn something if we already know it? And if we don't know it, how will we know it when we find it? Like, okay, this is a really good question. This is probably where Socrates is wanting him to go all along, where he is asking this question of, like if you go into a room, or I give you a, let's say a table, and I put a bunch of objects on it, and I ask you to pick out the blurb of all of those. Like, I don't know what a blurb is. And so it's like I can't find it because I don't even know what it is. And if I know what it is, I don't have to look for it because I know what it is and it's right there in front of me, so I don't have to really do any searching. And so this riddle, I guess, or this question is, from Meno's point of view, he's very frustrated and saying, I don't know, because if I don't know what a virtue is, like I don't know what it looks like, I can't really search for it because I'm not going to know it when I find it. But if I do know it, if I do know this definition, I can't learn it. I have to already know it. And then so Socrates, this sets him up, because what he wants to do is he wants to introduce his idea of recollection. And so he says, well, that is a good question. That is a really good question, but I've got an answer to it. He says, what if you don't learn things in that way, but you have recollection from previous lives? Since a soul is immortal, you are able to gain this knowledge because it's deep inside of you. So it's not so much a matter of you learning something as it is you remembering it, right? Because if I want to know who won the Academy Award 2 years ago, and I know, it's like at the back of my mind, it's like, oh, I think it was so-and-so. I think it was this person. I'm trying to remember. And at that point, you're not learning it for the first time. You're actually digging it up from inside of your memory and going, oh, that's right, it was so-and-so. And what he does, and recollection's a really important thing. And this is where there's this really sort of long section that if you're a math nerd, this is really interesting to you. But if you're not, you can just like skip it and don't worry about it, because he takes this slave, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna prove recollection to you. And he gets this slave who doesn't really know a lot about math or geometry, and he wants to say, hey, this, even though this slave doesn't think he knows a lot about geometry, he actually really does, because his soul, which is eternal, knows these things. And so he does this thing where he, like, okay, here's a square. If it's 2 by 2, what's the total area of it? Well, it's going to be 4. He's like, okay, so that's pretty easy. So what would it look like if you had a square twice as big as that? Like, what would that be? Like, well, let's see. If this one's 2, twice as big as 4, so I guess it'd be 4 by 4. It's like, well, no, actually that's 16. That's bigger than 8. All right, so I don't know. Well, it's got to be bigger than 2 and smaller than 4, so I don't know, 3? I was like, all right, let's check this out. Well, actually, the area of that is 9, so that's too big. And at this point, he's like, so slave, what is the answer? Like, how do you find the size of this square? The slave's like, I don't know what it is. And so Socrates kind of looks at Meno and says, look, see, what's happened here is the slave was kind of following, but he realizes I don't know this. And then he goes to this kind of weird where it's like, okay, so what would happen if you kind of tilted this square on its, over, 45 degrees or whatever, and then you use the diagonal as one of the sides, and then this is kind of the whole Pythagoras, a squared plus b squared equals c squared thing, blah, blah, blah. And, and so it's like, oh, we discovered, which it ends up being what, like double the square root of 2, something like that, 1.4 something or 2.8 something, which is between 2 and 3, right? Anyway, forget about that. That's just kind of a diversion. But he's trying to make this point that I didn't teach the slave any of that. He just kind of recollected all of that, which most people look at and they go, no, you kind of asked him a bunch of leading questions on it. So anyway, the whole point of that was to show that knowledge, or the things that we know, we haven't learned, but we're recollecting them from basically the past. So this is the second big section of this recollection thing. And then it kind of goes into this idea of, well, is virtue knowledge? And then Meno says, well, virtue is good. And so, there's a lot of good things like health and strength and beauty and those kind of things. But it is possible for those things to go bad on us. And this is sort of the Aristotle's, golden mean, where let's say you're brave. Well, you could go too far with that and just be reckless. You could have bravery, which is a virtue, but if you just run into battle and not even thinking about anything, and you just kind of get demolished in this battle, well, you were brave, but then you went beyond it, and so it turned from a virtue basically into a vice. And well, what's governing this? What keeps it a virtue and stops it from moving into, kind of going too far? And it's like, well, it's basically wisdom, that we have to kind of keep a virtue and not go too far with it. And Socrates could say, well, you weren't really born with wisdom, and you can't really learn wisdom. In fact, and this is one of the other basic or big sections where he's asking somebody else, like, so do you think virtue is teachable? Well, yeah. And then he gives this example, and we've all seen this, where, okay, so-and-so is a very virtuous person. Do you agree? Yeah. And he loved his sons, right? Yeah. And so he taught them wrestling. Yeah, and they learned wrestling. And then he taught them, how to be accountants or something. And yeah, they learned that too. He says, but were those kids virtuous? Well, no, not really. They turned out, pretty bad people. He goes, well, why didn't the dad teach the kid virtue? Well, he tried, he taught him how to throw a fastball, but he couldn't teach him virtue. And so he basically looks at these examples and saying, well, if virtue is teachable, then it would be taught. But it's not. Like, you can't find teachers and learners of virtue, so it must be something else. And this is where he goes into this riff about what knowledge is. And he says, well, there's two kind of ways to kind of be in the world. One is what we would call knowledge, and the other would be right opinion. So, for example, let's say that you want to come over to my house, and so I know how to get to my house, and I can give you directions on how to get to my house, and I could turn right here, turn left here, and it would be from my knowledge. But what would happen if somebody else, let's say that he prays about it and the Holy Spirit leads this person into knowing how, not knowing, but how to give me the right answer. And he doesn't really know because he's never been to my house before, but he has kind of the spiritual guidance of saying, well, turn left, right, whatever. And he gives this person, like, if they follow his belief or his right opinion, then that person ends up at my house. It's like, well, maybe it's a fluke, that kind of thing. But what would it look like if, on the one hand, somebody had exact knowledge and they knew exactly what was going on in the world, but on this other person, he had right opinion or a right belief? So in other words, he kind of is giving ideas that he doesn't really know for certain if it's right or not, but he kind of believes it, and so he keeps telling us. And if for this whole life, this one person had knowledge, which means he actually knows it, doesn't only believe it, but he knows it to be true. But on the other case, you have somebody with right opinion. He just believes it, but he turns out to be right like 100% of the time. Socrates is asking, at the end of the day, is there a difference between these? Like knowing something and then believing it and being right? And Meno has to say, well, really, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you know something or you just believe it if you're right the whole time. And so Socrates, yeah, absolutely, because right opinion is part of knowledge, but what makes it knowledge is that there is some sort of reason to believe it's true. Okay. In other words, like you believe something, But then you have what would be called maybe warrant. Sometimes it's used this way. So Socrates is saying, well, then, Meno, the conclusion is that virtue comes to the virtuous by the gift of God. So in other words, it's a belief, and it's not really knowledge. But we shall never know the certain truth until, before asking how virtue is given, we inquire into the actual nature of virtue, which brings us all the way back to the beginning, which is saying that, it could be that it's teachable, but that would mean it's knowledge, right? Because I can only really teach knowledge. Like I could teach you how to tie your shoes, but I know how to do that. And what I'm doing is I'm ultimately imparting this knowledge into you. But he says it's not really knowledge because it's not something that is taught from one person to the other. Like this virtuous father wasn't able to teach to his son. So he's saying it obviously wasn't knowledge that was taught. It had to be something else. How did this father get virtue but the son miss it? How is it that some people are virtuous and others aren't? And at the end of the day, really what Socrates is saying is that it's not knowledge, but it is belief. It's basically a gift from God about, how you become virtuous. So you can't really teach it. It has to be received through God, right? And so one of the sort of interesting applications, to get back to the knowledge part, is that this relates to what would be called Reformed epistemology. Alvin Plantinga, who's a famous philosopher, one of his major works was about justified true belief, where this is a form, this is a part of epistemology, which is this question of how do we know things. And what Plantinga says is that a true belief plus some sort of warrant is what he would call justified true belief, which is very similar, interesting, to what Socrates says, right? Because Socrates says the thing that makes it knowledge or justified true belief is that there's some sort of reason to believe this. Because if I know how to get to my house, I have my warrant or my reason is that I've been there, I've done this over and over again. So that makes it knowledge to me. Whereas if you're just praying the Holy Spirit and it gives you some sort of insight into how to get to my house, that's a true belief. And at the end of the day, if they're both lead to the right results, don't worry about it, right? And so what Plantinga is saying, and this is sort of interesting for a theological perspective, is that what Plantinga would say is that warrant for belief in God comes through what is called the sensus divinitatis. And this goes back to Calvin, where he talks about the sensus divinitatis is this sense of God. So just as you have the sense of sight or hearing or taste or touch or those sorts of things, is that people were created with the sensus divinitatis, a sense of God. And at the fall, this was lost, and that just as somebody can say, what color is this? Well, it's blue. Well, how do you know it? Well, I can see it. Like my eyes are telling me it's blue. What Plantinga would say is that people who believe in God and are Christians and have the sense of God, it is just as logical for them to say, I believe in God, as it is to say this is blue or this is red. Why? Well, it's blue or red because your eyes are working, or it's salty because you taste it. It's loud because you hear it. What Plantinga is saying is that this sensus divinitatis is this reason or this warrant that will lead a Christian to be able to say, yeah, I know there's a God because the sense is awake inside of me, and I can sense when this is happening, just as you can sense vision or anything like that. So I think this is interesting to bring up because Peter Boghossian, who is a philosopher at Portland State, has talked about Plantinga's thing and how it's a sort of ridiculous. Boghossian is he's an atheist and he doesn't believe in God. And he looks at Plantinga's ideas here. He says, he just makes this up out of nowhere. Well, no, not really. This goes all the way back to Socrates, right? And so what all Plantinga is doing is he's taking this Socratic idea and he is applying it to sort of an apologetic look at what Christians would say about this belief in God. Wow, that is a long way from this starting point of Virtue Teachable. And so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense of where we're going with this idea of meno. And boy, jump into it. This is an amazing dialogue, and just have fun with it and just take it where it leads you. There are a lot of different ways that it goes. And so, to quote the great Quill from The Mandalorian, I have spoken.